Okay, it looks like we're live. So a warm welcome to everyone and welcome back to those who've joined us in previous sessions. This is the Mind in Life Europe Mind Matters series, and this is specifically the Gaia series of our Mind Matters talks, which we started in 2023. So as many of you know, the Mind Matters series is really our most public-facing flagship series of talks at Mind in Life Europe. And this is where we hear from some of the world's most preeminent voices in contemplative, enactive, and systemic approaches to the mind. And since 2023, we decided to take up this notion of Gaia as a conceptual figurehead for this particular series, unfolding it in its various guises. So, of course, the scientific guise, but also philosophical, aesthetic, historical, and more. And it's really been a way for us of examining our entanglement with all of life. And so if you haven't had the pleasure of listening to the previous talks in the series, we'd really encourage you to go back and check them out on our YouTube channel. So there you can find the first talk in this series, which was given by Bruce Clark and Sébastien Dutreuil. And I see Bruce, I think, in the audience this evening, so it's nice to have him back. And then we followed that with a talk by David Abram, and then a talk by Tyler Volk, who's also back with us in the audience this evening. And we also hosted Ferris Jaber. And finally, this fall, we had the pleasure of welcoming Frédéric Aïtauti. And so this evening, this is actually the ultimate talk in this series. And as you've seen, we've had quite a lineup over these last 2 years, and we are thrilled to be ending with another very distinguished guest and a bearer of perhaps a more hopeful message and perhaps not, but we'll see how this unfolds throughout the talk this evening, but a message that's certainly grounded in many years, in fact, decades of scientific research. So with no further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker this evening, Professor Tim Lenton. So Professor Tim Lenton is the founding director of the Global Systems Institute at the University of Exeter and chair in climate change and earth system science. He has more than 25 years of research experience focused on modeling of the biosphere, climate, biogeochemical cycles, and the associated tipping points. And indeed, Tim is renowned for his work identifying climate tipping points, which inform the setting of the 1.5 degrees Celsius climate target, associated net zero targets, as well as nationally determined contributions. Tim works with policymakers and businesses, helping them assess the risks of climate change and nature loss and highlighting opportunities for what he has called positive tipping points that can accelerate change towards net zero. In 2023, Professor Lenton led a team of more than 200 people from over 90 organizations in 26 countries to produce an authoritative assessment of the risks and opportunities of both negative and positive tipping points in the Earth system and society. The Global Tipping Points report, produced in partnership with the Bezos Earth Fund, was published at the COP28. And so this evening, we really have the pleasure of hearing some of the latest thinking of Professor Tim Lenton. And the title of his talk this evening is, intriguingly, Gaia as Seen from Within. And so I think it could be no more appropriate that we end with the sort of inside perspective on the system of Gaia as we conclude this series. So I'm happy to hand it over to you, Tim, to start your presentation. And thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thanks, Johanna. Yeah, lovely to see you all. I think this talk could be part personal odyssey from Gaia to tipping points. And it's also going to be about how, although Gaia was sort of arrived at from a, you might say, a top-down view, I really become an advocate for understanding and seeing and acting in Gaia from within. So I'll try to explain that, how that sort of shift in perspectives was, well, those two different perspectives were there from the start. And I can see Seb Dutrail has joined in the session. And so some of what I say there really is inspired by the analysis Seb did in his PhD on the topic. All right, Gaia as seen from within. So the hero of our story, Jim Lovelock, seen here in his happy place, or one of his happy places, which was his laboratory. Although he's also in a happy place, well, pretty much anywhere you found him, if I'm honest. But he also was a very happy man if you were out walking the lanes, looking across at Dartmoor together, or whatever. So yeah, that's Jim probably as I knew him when I probably first met him about 30 years ago. This is Jim there on the left-hand side of the photo, just after World War II, in the early days of his research at the Medical Research Council in the UK. And interestingly, just after World War II, when this photo is taken, also the first image of the Earth sufficiently high up, if you like, to start to see the curvature of the Earth was taken from a V2 rocket with a motion camera on it, this image here. So this is arguably the first time, at least with photography, that the Earth was ever seen from the outside or nearly the outside, or Gaia, the living part of the Earth, was ever seen from the outside. It took till 1960 before we have a sort of real curvature of the Earth image from satellites. And by that time, um, well, Lovelock was about to have the reception of a wonderful letter from NASA HQ, a brand new organization, NASA at the time. But this is the letter from the Lovelock archives inviting Jim to join as a consultant at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in the space program at its very beginning, to be part of the missions, the first missions to Mars. And that, of course, was like a tipping point in Jim's life. He decided to abandon the security of tenure. He was getting a bit bored and frustrated and live off his wits as a consultant, not just to NASA, but to several other major organizations. And it was that, of course, that excitement and that journey to NASA and thinking about how to find life on Mars, the red planet, that gives us the kind of conventional story of how Lovelock and Diane Hitchcock began to come to the Gaia idea. Uh, I suspect many of you are familiar with this, but essentially, Lovelock was dismayed at the work of or the intentions of the biologists in the NASA space program to try to find life by designing particular instruments that would go on a Mars lander by digging and chemically analyzing the soil or sediment or regolith or whatever you want to call it on Mars. And Lovelock thought, well, it's crazy that they're all assuming that life would be like that on the Earth. We need a more general way of detecting life. And he definitely took a top-down view to that because he reasoned that having read Schrodinger's book on what is life, he thought about life in its broadest physical terms as the kind of wonderful islands of order in a universe heading towards disorder. And in order to maintain our little islands of order of being alive, we have to take in free energy, as physicists call it, from our surroundings and materials, degrade the energy and transform the materials to support our living state. And in so doing, Lovelock had the epiphany that life would inevitably use the atmosphere as a source of raw materials and a place to dump its waste products, which are different materials. And in so doing, life would transform the composition of the atmosphere of any planet on which it was abundant, including Mars. And so there was no need to go to Mars. And I don't think NASA were too happy with this assessment. But even in the mid 1960s, with early information from looking at in the infrared at the absorption spectra of gases from Mars and from Venus here, as well as knowing the composition of the Earth's atmosphere, you could tell that Mars's atmosphere and Venus's were close to what you'd expect just from chemistry, near what we'd call thermodynamic equilibrium, dominated by carbon dioxide. And the Earth is the magical anomaly in the inner solar system where CO2 has been drawn down by orders of magnitude. And instead, we've got loads of oxygen in the atmosphere. And amazingly, coexisting with that in the green, we've got what the chemists call reducing gases, methane and hydrogen, which are somehow coexisting with the oxygen that they want to react with like crazy. In fact, they'll they literally burn like a low flame in the Earth's atmosphere. And where I live near Dartmoor, I'm occasionally very lucky and I see like what we call a will-o'-the-wisp in English folklore, but the faint glowing flame of the methane and some phosphine coming off the bogs of Dartmoor actually igniting in the Earth's atmosphere. And so that's amazing thermodynamic disequilibrium. It could only be there if life was creating and maintaining it. And on top of that, Lovelock spotted what he already knew, that the composition of the atmosphere also had stability properties over geologic periods of time. And thus came his intuition that, oh wow, life is not just creating the Earth's extraordinary atmosphere, but also somehow regulating it over geologic periods of time. And sharing a corridor, if not an office, with Carl Sagan, talking about something that Sagan introduced to him, the faint young sun puzzle. Lovelock learned that, oh wow, that the sun's been burning brighter over time. It was way cooler or less luminous when Earth and life formed, about 30% less luminous. And yet the early Earth wasn't frozen. In fact, we knew even in the mid 60s it had liquid water. And from that, another leap of intuition from Lovelock that, oh wow, by controlling the composition of the atmosphere and the greenhouse effect, life could also be regulating the climate over geologic time. And that, of course, is the beginning of the Gaia hypothesis, which by around 1970, as Seb and Bruno's correspondence that they've published, the correspondence between Lovelock and Margulis that they've published shows, Lynn Margulis and Jim Lovelock, those were the two key collaborators who start to take this initial idea and flesh it out, basically. Um, and Lynn brings all this kind of deep microbiological and deep time perspective to Lovelock's kind of chemist's view of the contemporary Earth and its atmosphere. So she brings the time and the microbiological dimension, and together they write these famous papers published in the early 70s describing the hypothesis and making bold assertions that to think about, to ask questions like, what's the function of this gas or that gas for Gaia or the biosphere? Which, when a couple of evolutionary biologists have eventually paid attention and started thinking about, caused much consternation for them because Lovelock and Margulis were effectively saying, by asking what's the function of X or Y gas for Gaia, they're effectively saying that the composition of the atmosphere is like an adaptation of Gaia, and that means that it's somehow in their head the product of natural selection, and they can't see how that would work, and so on and so forth. Let's not get too bogged down in that argument. Suffice to say that I think everybody's been misled by Lovelock occasionally in his wonderful poetic prose, likening the Earth, or Gaia in this case, to an organism. I would urge everybody to drop that metaphor. And Lynn was quite firm on that right from the start in the 1970s. She said, what organism eats its own waste products? Question mark, exclamation mark. None of us. Gaia is incredible because Gaia, which I'm going to say is just a unique kind of type or class of entity and phenomenon. Gaia is this amazing nearly closed material cycling system, that's completely unlike an organism. So as Bruno Latour said later, you've got to treat it as of its own kind. Suffice to say, I think all of that still speaks to a sort of top-down path to Gaia, as does the way that Lovelock, in this is his doodling, by the way, again in the Science Museum archive, as does the way that Lovelock sort of draws out and thinks of this whole global, in this case, he would say cybernetic system as some giant feedback control system. That's quite a top-down, you would say, engineering view of the thing or the phenomena or the entity or whatever you want to think of it as. And indeed, the field I'm in of Earth system science will draw sort of entertaining parallels and sketches like the one at the bottom here with echoes of ancient, in this case, I think Christian religious iconography, where we are very much pictured as maybe the practitioners of planetary medicine as Lovelock had it, but rather sort of operating literally and sizing on Gaia or the Earth system from the top down here. Now, well, whatever you think about that, I'm going to switch gear and emphasize Seb's point, which is Gaia was also discovered from the bottom up. And I'm going to say probably many times, but later that, well, it's all very well pretending that you're outside the system and you can look at it from above. But only a very few humans, astronauts, have ever had the privilege of doing that. And they're only in a little capsule that's like an extension of Gaia that of life support that only lasts a temporary amount of time. So basically, almost nobody has or could have the view of Gaia from above as a totality. And so it's not a particularly um, useful or practical vantage point to work from. So, as Seb elucidates in his thesis, now a book you can buy, Jim also discovers Gaia in a sense from the bottom up, from sensing the activities of organisms, microbial or human, and the gases that they're making and exchanging with the world all the time. He does that because he was the wizard of creating exquisitely sensitive instruments, orders of magnitude more sensitive than anything anybody else had invented before, able to sniff out the tiniest concentrations of different reactive gases, including the most famous one, the electron capture detector here with the chamber and an example electron source below. Now, Lovelock uses this and other instruments he has and other lines of inquiry just to start, you could say, sniffing around and seeing what he can detect in the atmosphere and the world around him. He also takes very basic kind of empirical scientific approach. In this case, this is where he lived in Barrowchalk in Wiltshire until they moved house sometime around 1970, I think. And in this instance, he's just using his observations of why is the air so clear when the wind's blowing from the Atlantic and such a mucky air mass when it's coming from Europe. Aha, here's a clue that some thing or things, namely people, are pouring a load of pollutants into the atmosphere that I can observe from my house. But on top of the basic observation, Lovelock has calibrated, this is in the dilution chamber he built to calibrate his instruments. He's calibrated his exquisitely sensitive instruments himself and is going out, including with his daughter Christine here, and measuring the atmosphere, partly in this case in the west coast of Ireland, where he set up this famous observation station and collected flower samples, as you can see the two of them carrying here, but also on boats or ships. This is Jim photographed with the gas chromatograph he took on a famous voyage on the ship RRS Shackleton down the Atlantic, basically in 1971. Does it say on there? I can't see because I've got to hide my thumbnail picture of myself. But yeah, there we go, 1971. So what does Lovelock detect from the bottom up with his instruments? Well, he detects gases made by microbes that no one's found before called dimethyl sulfide and methyl iodide, for example. These are the major gaseous carriers of sulfur and iodine that kind of close the sulfur and iodine cycle, sending some of those crucial elements, sulfur and iodine, back from the ocean to the land. Oh, and that dimethyl sulfide also gets oxidized to this sulfate form that forms tiny particles that then water condenses on that then form clouds that become more reflective in the marine atmosphere, and that affects the climate, and so on and so forth. And Lovelock on his voyage discovers that chlorofluorocarbons made by people are all over the atmosphere, all over the planet, which is a pivotal piece of evidence for the fact that that pollution is persistent and could be a risk to the ozone layer above. So it's sniffing around from the bottom up through which Lovelock basically discovers how life, be it microbial or human, is just busy, just exchanging gases and transforming its surroundings, particularly its atmosphere and then its climate. And the amazing thing is really how far, if you trace the sort of gases, you trace their path, the emanations of the microbes or the humans, if you like, if you just keep following those gases across the membranes of many organisms in which they might come in or out or whatever, the amazing thing is you keep on going and you find, wow, these are little effects of little life on gases extend to a huge scale. They extend out to transforming the whole global atmosphere over geologic periods of time, even billions of years. That's Gaia as seen from within. That's the bottom up path. Both paths, I think, inform the famous original book on Gaia, 1979. Um, in response to that book and the evolutionary biologists and their kind of cantankerous response to Gaia, Lovelock also goes on his sort of theoretical quest, building or inventing this a model he called Daisy World. Here's an example of one of the variants of it, where again I'd argue he's sort of thinking from the bottom up to explain the large scale or top down phenomena, because he basically invents a model to show how, oh, just automatically organisms doing their thing or just being different colors of daisy in bottom up natural selection type competition could end up regulating the whole temperature or climate of an imaginary planet, which is what the Daisy World model does. And that kind of theory angle, together with, well, the angle that Lynn Margulis brought of deep time, those crucial elements then shape Lovelock's famous second book on the Ages of Gaia. Still, to my kind of reading, well, a very temporally grounded book, a book about deep history, but definitely not just a top-down view. There's a lot to be. You can read this book as a very bottom-up view as well. It's really about how on earth did those very first microbes extend their influence in space and time to 4 billion years on the global scale. Um, I I had the pleasure of meeting Jim a little bit later than that book, about 1992 in person, and then by 1994, he, bless him, invited me, who's hiding in the middle here, along to the first of a series of meetings, famous meetings in Oxford that I see Tyler on the front row there. Well done. That were hosted with actually a cast of fascinating characters here, as we all started to sort of engage with and disentangle Gaia. For what it's worth, I was captivated, obviously, by the subject, but also by trying to disentangle how you could couple or think about the coupling between the evolution of life below the timeline of 4.5 billion years here and its major events of evolution, major transitions in evolution. How could you couple that to our understanding of the major tipping points, I'm going to call them, in the history of Gaia, in which we got a more oxygenated atmosphere, the so-called Great Oxidation, or an even more oxygenated atmosphere later on, and then in a way a world in which we could evolve. I started doodling and working on that, or writing this down, as you can see, in the early 2000s. Um, Kept chewing it over, ended up writing a book with Andy Watson about what you might call, we called the revolutions that made the Earth, the inception of life and of an amazing material cycling system, the oxygen revolution in which the atmosphere is transformed and suddenly you have a much greater power source in combining an oxygen-rich atmosphere with the food to fuel life. Another oxygen rise and the rise of complex life later on. And then the big question mark, are we going to be the start of another revolution of Gaia, or are we just going to be this kind of short-lived aberration, that this kind of crazy party that burns all the fossil fuels out quickly and basically destroys itself and quite a few other things besides? Well, yeah, I won't dwell on that, but we'll come back to that. But I feel like that was my efforts with colleagues to just keep trying to untangle this story from within or from the bottom up. But I want to turn from the science into a sort of broader dimension, maybe even bring in a bit of politics ultimately here, because as Lovelock recognized in this quote from the end of his first book, there's more to Gaia than just the science. There's a whole new
I think Tim's connection is down. Tim, can you hear us, or are you completely up? I think we just lost him. And I think he's back.
Oh, that was upsetting. Where did I get cut off, folks? Oh dear.
You were showing Jim's quote. You said you were going to
Oh,
move into politics. You were on that
That's
slide.
good. Thanks, Tyler. So you didn't lose too much. I don't know why you got cut off there. Sorry, folks. All right. So we're going to try and broaden out from the science of Gaia now to the kind of broader implications of the bottom-up view. Um, I've switched over the camera. Sorry if it doesn't look right now because I need to try and make sure the internet's stable. Well, as you saw on the previous slide, I got really excited, motivated when I saw Bruno Latour's book and his lectures on facing Gaia. And I got really excited that someone who could come left field from the philosophy, sociology, thinking of that Bruno pioneered could latch onto Gaia and suddenly, well, kind of inject not in well, I was going to say a new perspective or energy into the subject, but you might say just um, took took part of the perspective that was already there and ran with it. And with Sebastian, we had a lot of fun, the three of us together working on that. But what I want to highlight is Latour really understood this idea that we need to orient and see Gaia from within. And it's from that perspective that you can really engage with its practical and what he would say political ramifications. And he liked the language of thinking of ourselves oriented in the critical zone. This is the book that was published around the Critical Zones exhibition on the Centrum Karlsruhe Media. That critical zones is a word or a terminology that comes from a bunch of geeks like me, geochemists who like to go out and measure. Ooh, well, how is the life affecting the weathering and making the soil, and how's the water filtering through the soil, and how's that turning into the watershed and everything else in particular locations around the world, critical zone observatories, the scientists call it. Latour, in his brilliance, saw this as a sort of instantiation of let's engage with Gaia from where we're sat or standing or running or swimming or whatever you want to think of it as, from the bottom up, following the path in a way Lovelock followed of just thinking about and tracing the consequences of our actions and those of the microbes and the trees and the whatever else around us, breathing quote unquote in and out or exchanging all these gases and other materials with our surroundings. That way, we'll really start to see our connection, our intertwinedness with all the other living things and the non-living stuff of the air and the soil and the rest of it. And with Alexandre Arène, Jérôme Gaillardet, well, Alexandra, she's an architect partly by training as well, came up with this really cute way of like reorientating visually. Apparently, this is uses some kind of tricks that are tricks of the trade if you're trained as an architect or a designer, but it's like a literal shifting of perspective in a visual form to sort of instead of looking from the outside, kind of center yourself in the middle. And now the thing that we think of as underneath us, like the rocks of the earth or whatever, becomes the outside of the diagram, weirdly. The sun is off in another plane, powering the whole system. But what we trace as we go from the atmosphere outwards to the topsoil and down into the deeper soil and down towards the earth crust in the arrows is like the exchange and cycling of different materials, elements like carbon or sulfur or nitrogen or phosphorus or whatever. And there's a whole lot of fun, by the way, you can have with this, with the sort of angle of the arrows and the way that this can capture the different time scales as well as the expanding space scales of the influence of you and I, or the microbes, or the soil bugs, or whatever. Suffice to say, I quite like it. It's a sort of deliberate graphical attempt to reorient, reorient to where we can really engage with the fact that well, this is our life support system. We are within it. We are completely dependent on all those other living things, especially the microbes. They don't, by the way, depend on us. We can't live without them. They can get along fine without us. That has some quite profound moral, ethical, whatever you want, philosophical and political implications if we were actually to fully take that worldview on board. It would certainly fly in the face of the underpinning worldview that traces back a long way, no doubt, to the beginnings of Judeo-Christian religion, if not before, and certainly rose to prominence in the scientific revolution, the idea that basically nature's there purely for human emancipation. Gaia is a different nature to that nature, and that's something Bruno Latour was passionate about us trying to communicate. Gaia is offering us a fundamentally different worldview with fundamentally different implications. At the same time, we discover this slowly but surely as we are seriously disrupting the system in all its majesty. So I might have lost my x-axis here. Sorry, folks. That's kind of cute because I like to say to people, oh, if you just showed these traces to a cardiologist or an electrical engineer and asked them if the system was stable, if they were good at their job, they'd say no, because this is a sawtooth oscillation. It happens to be the Ice Age cycles, because the scale that's missing is the last 650,000 years on the bottom. But we have the carbon dioxide level in blue and a temperature proxy in white. Following this sawtooth oscillation, on the cold phases is the Ice Ages, the brief. Let me get my laser pointer out. Sorry, the brief peaks of the interglacial fevers, as Lovelock would call them. And while the CO2 and the temperature change in lockstep, that's for sure. But the biggest picture message that I would give, or Jim would have given, looking at this is, oh wow, Gaia is not super stable right now. We might be in an unusually unstable interval for the climate. Because whenever you see a system oscillating like this following the sawtooth, it tells you, okay, it's still bounded. There's still some damping feedbacks that set the bounds on the oscillation. But really, there's a lot of amplifying feedback in the system that's supporting the oscillation and supporting the very abrupt changes, the abrupt exit out of the ice ages. So here we are. We're in this pretty unusually, I would say, unstable mode in the system when maybe it's signaling to us it's nearing some kind of tipping point anyway, where the positive feedbacks might take control and send us off into some new climate state, as has occasionally happened in the history of Gaia, the sort of tipping points that, or the revolutions that made the Earth. And it's against that backdrop, along we come, take advantage of 10,000 years of climate stability in the Holocene, to really get going with agriculture, then get going with those fossil fuels, push the CO2 level up to there already, and on up off to the top of the slide within another generation if we don't change fast. And okay, the temperature has gone up. I haven't put it on. It's gone up somewhat, but this will give you a clue that there's already a lot more committed warming in the pipeline, even though the relationship with these from CO2 to temperature isn't quite as severe as this suggests. The temperature should go up with the logarithm of the CO2, but still, we should not be surprised to think that we might cross some tipping points, some big tipping points in Gaia if we hit the system that hard. So I'm just showing you now, I'm switching gear a little bit, showing you a little toy movie of a system that I'm pushing towards a tipping point, a system that has two different stable states, at least to begin with, the two valleys, and it's in the one on the left. But I've been making that state on the left less and less stable until there we saw it from blue to red, and the system tipped out of that state in an abrupt and hard to reverse way into a different state. And this quality of tipping points, well, we've kind of seen it in the history of Gaia on the biggest stage of all, albeit those ones are rare. But there's the potential for tipping points in all kinds of complex systems, Gaia being one such complex system, but within Gaia, our societies and economies being another kind of complex system. And the same recipe is underneath tipping points in all cases. Some damping feedbacks that regulated the system and maintained the status quo have got weaker over time, and some amplifying feedbacks have got stronger and they take over at the tipping point. Okay, so what are the bad tipping points, or the ones in Gaia stroke the climate that we need to be worried about? Well, I've written plenty about that. This was our map that we drew up 15 or so years ago of the candidates we saw then and the one that we'd already passed in my lifetime and were busy trying to repair, the Antarctic ozone hole. The one where Jim's measurements from the bottom up really provided a crucial piece of the science to explain why that thing came about. But then the rest of this is all kinds of stuff that could tip in the climate system. I wasn't going to give a long lecture on that. Suffice to say, the map continues to be updated, and more things go onto it than come off, and the more we learn and the more non-linear the climate change becomes, the more alarmed we are that we're closer to or already passing the tipping points. And that thinking, of course, in turn informed this thing, which was the planetary boundaries concept, which I was one of the authors of, where we kind of pointed out what to me actually at the time was already the blindingly obvious, that if you're trained in Gaia, you know that there are limits, and this is our life support system. If we push it too hard in particular dimensions, it's not a sustainable situation, and it's going to come, in some metaphorical sense, come back to bite us sooner or later. So you could say that this comes out of the Earth system science tradition, but I think it's kind of that in turn, as Seb and I have tried to describe, is itself born out of the Gaia thinking. So where are we? That's a bit about where we are. And what are we going to do? Well, we could do all sorts of things, but including continue kind of destroying ourselves and much else besides. But a few of us, at least, are thinking, hold on a minute, the consequences of our actions on Gaia or the Earth system that some of us are monitoring and modeling are not good. They're pathological, and maybe we're already starting to think about changing or actually changing our actions or our behavior so that they don't cause such disruption to Gaia, because we've realized that's not smart. That's basically, it doesn't, it's not a good strategy to fundamentally disrupt your life support system. If some of us are starting to do that, and incidentally, instead of the brain, we should have a bunch of people talking to each other in this circle. But if some of us are starting to do that, then we see something new in Gaia, which is a kind of little bit of self-aware self-regulation on the part of us, the humans, or some of the humans. Up to now, Gaia's been getting on fine without us, you could say, and doing everything, the regulation such as it is of the climate, the cycling of the elements. None of it has been consciously designed or controlled. It's an understandable scientifically understandable property, complex systems property out of all of those actions, of all of those microbes and everybody else just um, doing everything they can, like all living organisms, to thrive and flourish. Now we have the question, could humans be adding a little bit of self-awareness to the Earth's self-regulation? And I glibly decided to label that an idea of Gaia 2.0. And Bruno quite liked that. And we wrote a little piece about it together. And what we were thinking about there was, okay, interesting observation, Tim, as Bruno would say, but who are these people who might be playing this conscious role in Gaia, and what sort of consciousness could be expected of them? Because frankly, we have a over-aggrandized idea of both how smart we are and how special this consciousness thing is anyway. And crucially for me, well, which aspects of Gaia could we, the self-aware, learn from and perhaps replicate if we're in an effort to determine, let's say, a better fate of Gaia 2.0 for us? I was really interested in that third question, and we just started to sketch out some maybe very basic observations of what one might draw out of our understanding of Gaia to, in the very loosest sense, guide us or give us some clues towards finding a happier, more sustainable, what would you say, balance with the rest of Gaia. So firstly, Gaia, as we've seen, is composed of networks of agents, most of them microbial. And so of course is human society, as Latour and his collaborators have been teaching us for decades. It should be an actor network view of the human enterprise, just like the Gaia or the microbial enterprise. Gaia is of course powered by the free energy from sunlight, captured by things called cyanobacteria, is a colonial form that also fixes nitrogen called trichodesmium that's abundant in the world ocean. The cyanobacteria then found their way, if you like, to become the plastids, the photosynthesizing bit of algal and plant cells. But of course, we are just on the brink of an energy revolution, which will be largely solar, because now solar voltaic power is the cheapest way of generating electricity in almost all of the world. Even when you factor in the cost of storing electricity when the sun isn't shining in batteries, which are also getting ever cheaper, it makes sense now in most of the world to shut down fossil fuel power plants, replace them with new solar panels and battery storage. And solar panels are only getting cheaper the more we make and the more we learn by doing and have economies of scale. So we're already on the tipping point of a sort of solar revolution, to the cheapest electricity we've ever had and the cleanest, of course, and certainly mimicking Gaia, empowering ourselves from the sun if we can go there. But of course, it's not just about power supply or energy, as Lovelock realized right from the start in the mid-1960s. It's about materials as well. And what Gaia teaches us in the diagram on the left is, wow, if, without life, there's just pretty meager, we say fluxes of gases coming up and down at the Earth's surface, coming out of volcanoes or whatever. And look at it with life today on Earth in Gaia. There's just, as Tyler wrote about back in whenever it was, 98, Tyler, look at it. There's this amazing recycling system. There's life is just pouring out and all this gas taking it up, taking it in, taking it up, pushing it out, taking it in. This is the signature of huge amounts of material cycling. It's a logarithmic scale. And it's by spinning around all the materials you need to build your bodies and capture sunlight and everything else in the cycles of life that life can be, Gaia can be as productive and planet transforming as it is. If you just try to run Gaia or biosphere off what comes out of volcanoes with no recycling, then we wouldn't be here to talk about it. There'd just be a squitty little biosphere of a few microbe extremophiles hanging on for existence. But that's not the way it works. Right from the start, life closed the cycling loops bootstrapped itself into this flourishing state. And lo and behold, it's pretty obvious to me, at least, that that's something we've got to learn. We've got to learn to cycle far, far better all the materials we want or need to make all the stuff we want or need to flourish. That applies to the food system, but also to sort of all the other dimensions of the industrial economy, or whatever you want to think of it as. We need to state the blindingly obvious. We've got to, in the long run, we've got to go towards a materially closed, so-called circular economy, and we've got to think about the ways of changing the rules and the governance systems to incentivize that. And we can talk about that later. But that's an obvious lesson from Gaia. There's a sort of there's an information lesson as well as an engineering and materials lesson, though, which is, unlike our current human societies where everything is very hierarchical in terms of information flow and restriction thereof, Gaia and life, microbial or otherwise, is just brilliant at exchanging information horizontally, including genes, through this thing called horizontal gene transfer, but also in things like social insect colonies. Beautiful examples of how simple information exchange between the worker ants works really well as a problem-solving system. So Bruno liked this word, heterarchy. We need a heterarchy in terms of information and power rather than a hierarchy. And heterarchies are pretty resilient and robust, including in the face of change, including the change that maybe in our case they've caused at the global scale. And then what would we be doing with all this? Well, maybe the lessons from microbes onwards is when you've got those ingredients, you can create transformative change, of course, of the whole planet. But maybe the clue is that there's a theory of change buried in this, that if we thought in a Gaia way and thought about how the microbes do it, it's like you want to foster lots of bottom-up little islands of activity that are innovating, and then their consequences are spreading out. And in the human sense, with the human forms of information transfer that we have now, Wikipedia or internet or whatever you want to, social media or whatever you want to think of, we certainly have opportunities, if we think smart, to not only have cultures that support lots of experimentation and innovation towards Gaia 2.0 and what that could look like, but share their learning, their successes, their failures, share it more effectively from the bottom up between all these little islands of innovation, so that somehow we muddle our way towards making peace with Gaia, flourishing, cycling, all the rest of it. Right, which is kind of the thesis of my work, the underlying thesis of my work on positive tipping points, which is, wow, we're in big trouble with the bad climate Earth system tipping points. And at the moment, we're just trying to change incrementally, and that isn't going to cut it. We're going to hit climate catastrophe, ecological emergency, whatever you want to call it, Gaia emergency. We're hitting that pretty soon and pretty fast, and we're just not changing quick enough. We're changing you can take basic metrics like how fast are we eliminating greenhouse gas emissions from our collective activities, and the answer is not fast enough. We're going more than 5 times too slowly at doing that. You could ask the same question about our relationship with nature. We're still destroying nature in the net. We're nowhere near getting to nature net positive, as it's called, or nature positive. We've got some serious acceleration to do. We can't. And so that's why I've been emphasizing, okay, we need to find and trigger deliberately some tipping points that create self-propelling, self-accelerating change to desirable state, decarbonized economy, as it's called, nature positive, not nature negative. And of course, it's tipping points of behaviors and technologies, because they're the things that produce the emissions of the gases that are excessive and are disrupting Gaia. But it's probably also underneath that tipping points of what we call social norms as academics, and underneath that, the big tipping point of worldview to Gaia worldview, away from kind of Latour would call it modernist worldview, call it what you like. So I'm probably running out of time. I don't need to give you lots of examples that positive tipping points can happen, and they are happening. Here's the instigators of one of them. Uh, Members of the pop band a-ha, their architecture professor friend Harold Rosvick in the middle, their environmentalist friend Frederick over there, photographed in 1989 with hobby converted electric vehicle, in this case at the annual solar electric vehicle races in Switzerland in 1989. But there, with the media following them everywhere they go, by the way, because this is the lead singer of a world famous pop band at the time. But with a quest, you could call it a quest for Gaia if you want, but their quest was to show to the people of Norway, and especially the government of Norway, that there was an opportunity to live much more sustainably, in this case to electrify transport, but they also worked, Harold in particular, on passive house homes and solar power and everything else as a whole system view of a sustainable way of being. And they were busy in this case with a campaign and a bunch of policy demands to incentivize a transition to electric vehicles in Norway. Not time to tell you the brilliant story of how they fought to get those policy demands accepted over the course of the 1990s, but they did. So the photo was taken before the graph starts here. A lot of policies were starting to get in place in the early 2000s, and they were basically incentives that made it more encourage the adoption of electric vehicles so that they would cost less to buy, and they'd get access to bus lanes in cities like Oslo and things like this. The long and the short of it is, it's those agents or actors in the system, just a small group of them, who end up being responsible for the fact that Norway, in this case, has tipped completely from petrol and diesel vehicles dominating the market to electric vehicles in the last 10 years. And it's 10 years ahead of the rest of the world in that. So it's a nice little story of that, bottom-up action starts to spread. Here's my only other example for today, but we've also been having tipping points in energy supply here in good old Great Britain. We've tipped away from coal burning. That's the black line here. It was 40% of our power in 2012, and it fell off a cliff in the space of about 5 years. It didn't take much action, and it was my friends who know about this tell me it was a kind of almost accidental. There were efforts in government, including putting what was called a floor price on carbon emissions in the power sector, a pretty modest price. They were hoping that would help shift the system towards renewables, that they were also pushing in the UK and have been since we put the Climate Change Act in law back in 2008, I think, or maybe a bit later. But basically, through some part luck, part design, a little price on carbon in the power sector was enough to make coal burning unprofitable, and the people who were invested in it quickly pulled their money out, causing more people to pull their money out in a classic reinforcing feedback. And as you can see, we tipped away from coal power, and we tipped to renewables, which have been growing ever since, and now provide well over 40% of our power this year. And it's irreversible tipping point for coal burning in the UK, because we've destroyed the coal burning power stations, and the last one closed about 2 months ago. Whilst at the same time, of course, the lights haven't gone out, although electricity demand, without anybody noticing it, has gone down a good 20% in the space of about 15 years in the UK. And of course, renewables are on the rise. And happily, renewables, as I said already, the revolution of renewables is on the rise globally. I'd say we've still got plenty of work to do to get towards that positive tipping point to a circular economy, the information dimensions I talked about, and maybe the tipping point in worldview to Gaia. Plenty of work to do, folks, as usual. But as you might be aware, we've continued to sort of summarize and pull these threads together in our global tipping points report that we did a year or so ago, and we're going to do another iteration in a year's time, and we're welcoming whoever wants to join our community of thought and action on that. And we'll also be hosting a second kind of international conference on the potential for for what we typically call global tipping points, but maybe we can call them Gaia tipping points next end of June, start of July, if you want to join us. I think that's all from me, really. I hope it's conveyed something about this, how we came to see Gaia from within, and how that worldview of Gaia from within could be crucial to informing the action we desperately need, if we're not just going to be a blip in the future geological record. So thanks to Jim and Bruno, thanks to you for your attention. That's me running off into the not quite sunset on Dartmoor.
Well, thank you. A big round of applause from all of us. If you can see on the gallery view, everyone's giving a round of applause. It's too bad on Zoom we can't actually express that more fulsomely. But thank you so much, Tim, for this at once sobering but also very nuanced talk this evening. And we have just over half an hour for discussion and questions. So anyone who'd like to jump in, please just raise your virtual hand and you can unmute yourself. And if you're not in a position to unmute yourself, you can also drop a question in the chat and we can read that out for you to Tim. So please don't be shy. I'm imagining there's actually lots of burning questions in the room because of the material we've just seen. Yeah, Tyler.
Okay, now I'm on. Tim, that was great. Thank you. Really inspiring. To talk about materials for just a little bit. There's been some work, particularly by a group in Austria, on material stocks, and the way they're going up, obviously, and related to GDP, let's say per capita material stock and per capita GDP. And so I wonder if you could comment on, even though the circular economy is the way is the way Gaia works.
It ain't the way we're working at the moment.
And we have a ways to go with even our current material stock, but it looks like we would need, most of the world is going to want to build up their material stock as they develop. So I sometimes think of the analogy of a ecological succession, where the field and we're not yet quite at the full growth yet, where we could
well
go there. So
indeed, Tyler. Well, indeed, some different parts of the world are maybe at different stages on that succession. On the plus side, over on your side of the pond, for some time now, the US has recycled about half of its iron and steel. So we're not a totally hopeless case. But I totally agree with your argument. There's some transition to go on. And then there's basically a fundamental discussion to be had here about first of all, can growth be dematerialized? And those who are following the data on this carefully will probably concur that no is the answer, not completely. No evidence yet that if you continue pursuing indefinite GDP growth, that you can imagine doing that without it carrying material consequences. And the obvious lesson from that is, well, we can't continue indefinite GDP growth, but I wouldn't be the first person to say that. So in this tipping of worldview and this whole potential to tip to a circular economy, I think it becomes obvious that we have to reject, or at minimum add some things to our current measure of progress. After all, the person who came up with GDP as a metric advised very strongly to governments that it should not be used as a principal measure of human well-being or progress, and no one paid attention. So part of shifting to a circular economy, and all the rest of what I've talked about, is also about shifting how we conceive of what it means to flourish and be well, two different ways of measuring that, and that in turn, of course, is informed by this other thing, which is we've tipped worldview and realized that the reality is different, and we need to incarnate different rules and regulations around that, because by word, it's to get through that transition, that succession, and then get to the circular economy. It's going to take a radically different incentivization system. As you know, Tyler, we're going to be pouring, if we want to get anywhere near material closure like Gaia, you're putting more and more free energy in on the sort of law of diminishing returns to get closer and closer to perfect recycling. And you just would never do that in the way we currently structure an economy. But so there's plenty to work on. Let's leave it there.
I think
Yeah.
one possibly interesting thing is to take the carbon and rather than stuffing it somewhere out of the system, use it in some kind of way. For example, more wood buildings.
I totally support that, Tyler. And my friend John Shelhoub has been a pioneer in the Bauhaus Earth, or whatever, Bauhaus Europe, Bauhaus Earth movements, to totally, let's make wooden building stock of cities of the future. I love that. I think that's Gaia thinking right there. Yeah, so loads of great stuff for us as a community, I think, to get into here, to unpack, well, what is this Gaia 2 point whatever look like, and what forms could it take? I wrote about it as Gaia devices, I think 10 or so years ago, but we still need to imagine and invent what the Gaia devices are. So thanks. Yeah, it's great to be back with people who get this, because I'm afraid we're still in the minority, despite some of our best efforts to popularize this way of thinking. I can see Laura's got a hand up. I don't know who else has got a hand up because I'm not paying attention to the thing.
Laura, do you want to unmute yourself? And thanks for the question, Tyler. It's great.
Yes. Hello. Can you hear me? Yes.
Yeah.
Hi. Thank you very much. I really liked your presentation, and I think that your work is very important. So thank you for doing this. And well, I'm thinking about what you said about conscious action at some point with your work with Bruno Latour, and I'm personally quite concerned about the crisis of responsibilities that we are experiencing nowadays. And we know, the problems of misinformation, and, also being submerged by the climate denialism, misinformation outside our will. So I'm wondering if conscious action is really what is achievable for the many, or if we need to find some sort of action that can be, also working indirectly in a way, so that this positive tipping points can take place. Because I was also thinking about you had this visual image with this circle, there was this conscious action and then this transformation, etc. And you say that, well, some of us can undertake this conscious action. And I was thinking, but how many are needed? And I was thinking, maybe we are not enough. We are still a minority, right? So I don't know if there are studies also that thinks in terms of the numbers. How many participants are needed? Yes, please.
Well, the whole lesson of social tipping points is you only need a minority to get to a tipping point, which will ultimately lead everybody to change. We've seen that time and time again. Abolition of slavery, votes for women, civil rights movement in the US, you name it. So that's the first thing to say on the last point. You don't need everybody to instigate change for everybody to end up changing. It's with the publisher, the book I've written on the positive tipping points, but I had a lot of fun writing about that, and that should be an empowering message for us all. As to consciousness, Seb will back me up on this, but I, as like a someone who has a scientific calling, just like Jim Lovelock, my hero, is I'm quite an innately rational being, and I kind of had quite a kind of positive view on consciousness and ability to exercise foresight and all the rest of it. And Bruno Latour, I love him. He would just laugh at me. Seb will back me up on this. He'd just like go, Tim, you kidding yourself? And he would point me to all the neuropsychological etc. research that essentially the way he would paraphrase it, I'm not is, hey, this thing that we experience as consciousness, it's just this kind of clunky filtering thing going on in our brains, basically. We're giving it far too much kind of, I don't know, we're putting on too much of a pedestal would be his view. Also, if you just look practically at humans' performance and exercising foresight on, well, pretty much any issue, but especially on any environment-related issues, our track record is absolutely appalling. So he would always caution me to stop being too naively optimistic about our powers of consciousness, but also at the same time remind us that we have often amazingly muddled a way through. Still, I loved the metaphors he used to bring to this. He used to say, oh, we think we wrote this in the original piece. We're really talking about giving the white cane to the blind man to help them fumble around in the dark or something. In other words, yes, you're right. Let's operate from perhaps a base assumption that's pretty, you might say, quite negative about our conscious capabilities. But let's recognize we do a lot of following each other, that tipping dynamics can need only the minority, that we can be influenced by, whether you like it or not, by what's so-called nudging or actions that change our choice architecture, as they glibly call it in psychology. Now, of course, that's being done for nefarious ends as well as positive ones by advertisers. But you've got to know the tools you've got at your disposal, right? So I don't have all the answers, but I think even if we take, I'm going to call it I was going to call it a Latourian or a dimmer view of our various capabilities. Remember, the microbes do not need to be conscious to run a beautiful, flourishing, and successful system for billions of years. So there's ways through this, but there's ways through this that don't have to necessarily overplay that card, shall we say? Enough said. Not pretending that I've worked them all out yet, but I feel like, why are we all on this call together? Some of us have got to form a community of practice as well as thought and experimentation, and just an expression and everything else, and try and work this stuff out.
Thank you very much.
I see, Sebastian, you made a comment in the chat. Also, I don't know if you want to read that out or if you're able to unmute yourself. He just says Bruno would have had very much welcomed the quote-unquote move/add from consciousness to the social activist importance, even though they do not move everyone.
Yeah. So we'll also attest to the fact that at some point we were around Bruno's table in the flat in Paris, and I was probably telling him about this book I was going to write on positive tipping points, and he was saying, "This is a terrible idea, Tim. You can't mash all these different dimensions of social thinking about and under the same metaphorical umbrella as your Earth system tipping points, and you're risking just diluting the power of the message on the Gaia tipping points." So I'm like begging his forgiveness, deceased, as it were. I imagine his ghost kind of chuckling at me for having had the folly of carrying on regardless. But thanks, Seb. Yeah, I think he would at least like the activist angle. Yeah.
So we have about 20 minutes for more questions. Feel free, even just comments also, if you want to just engage. Yeah, Bruno.
Hey there.
Hey.
Hey, Tim. Thanks so much. Just the line of what you were bringing up just recently reminded me of, I'm working with a group right now, and we've just been reading through Gregory Bateson's Effects of Conscious Purpose on Human Adaptation.
Oh,
And
wow.
it just seemed to completely sort of preview the dilemma of, what is consciousness good for if its conscious intentions lead you right over the cliff of your current system. And so it's not like Bateson had any positive prescription, but the gist of his discussion was that to realize how much always remains unconscious and yet is is a major factor in your world nonetheless. And so that's why you need art and religion and the non-rational, or whatever you want to call the creative, unconscious, being brought along in terms of your conscious knowledge. So I think Latour, of course, understood that, and that's why he worked with our last speaker, Frederick, on staging Gaia and getting the message out in completely different ways. And like our friend Peter Horton with the Gaia Choir, sings Gaia, and that all of these ways of doing Gaia are important as well.
Totally agree, and I'm minded to go back and redraw the loop a few times, actually, because what I was really trying to convey was, let's not dwell on that kind of disembodied brain idea, which is nonsense, as Latour said. I was really trying to convey, this is more like what my process philosopher friends here in Exeter would describe as, it's about getting into the dance of agency with Gaia. It's about performative action and reaction. And well, I did this. I was trying to get to a more sustainable state. So I got together with my community or my buddies, and I was doing my permaculture project, or I tried this innovation, or I tried that, and that seemed to work, but then that didn't work. And it's basically get into the mess of action and engagement, and learn by doing, and share the learning in the heterarchy. And maybe in that way, we're going to muddle through with some, just trying stuff. And I love the fact that Lovelock, he would always emphasize the power of intuition, the way he'd kind of found an answer or a solution or an instrument or something that worked without understanding how it did work. So he was really, really great on downplaying this mythology of, okay, I had all this rational thought, and that ended up in this electron capture detector or this daisy world model or whatever. Absolutely to the contrary. The Lovelockian tradition is one of, you kind of, I don't know, you tap into intuition, whatever, you find something that works, and then sometime later on, as Latour teaches us, you reverse work out how the thing works, and maybe you tell yourself a different story about how you got to it. But yeah, as Latour taught us all, that's exactly the norm. We kind of stuff happens, you could say, and amazing things sometimes get created, and later on we maybe work out how it works and why what doesn't work. But the crucial thing would be, inaction is not an option anymore, is it? I mean, it's a political agenda, right? We've got to, if you accept the basic premises of the argument I put down, we've got to really ramp up action, and we've got to get in that learning journey, which maybe is a bit like how consciousness or whatever actually works. It's we're going to try lots of things, and then there needs to be some intelligent filtering of what works and some reinforcement learning, just like in the neurons in my brain. And but now on the scale of new way of being in Gaia, or whatever you want to call it. Peter's got his hand up. I can see
I
that.
have indeed, yeah.
Peter, please go ahead.
Can I go?
Yeah,
Lovely.
please go ahead.
Hi, Tim. Well done. Excellent chat. I want to throw in a couple of things there, especially on that last point about consciousness and stuff, because I would thank you, Bruno, for the plug of the Gaia Choir. By the way,
yeah, brilliant.
I come to the Gaia stuff not as a scientist at all, but as a theatre type music type person, and as an educator, I was my qualifications in education, so I'm fascinated by questions like what is it we're teaching and why are we teaching this to kids?
Yeah.
And a couple of the things I use from the Gaia, the message for me, and this first one relates to consciousness, is that if we are permutations of the wisdom of the biosphere, which is what Lynn Margulis describes us as, so we are our heritage, speaking as organisms and on a cellular level, actually goes back 3,600 million years. We are directly descendant from all that bacterial activity. In a way, we're bound to have this kind of consciousness of that memory. Well, I call it a Gaia memory. So when we have those moments and I go, that's a Gaia memory that gave me that idea. So the bacteria tell me that through some strange channels. And then if you add onto that all the new stuff, that all the holobiont stuff. That now, we are actually not just one genome, but we are all these genomes which are working all the time. So you've not only got your Gaia memory, you've got all these mates in your team, as Scott would call them, that are also are living the moment that you're living. So they're reacting to all that. Now, why shouldn't we be sensitive to that in some way that we don't understand? Exactly right. So that's the way I interpret that. I call it the Gaia memory, and the Gaia kind of perception going on all the time. But the one other thing I'd just quickly like to introduce into this is the one idea which we haven't talked about today, but what I find really powerful, trying to separate the way we're behaving and the way Gaia behaves and how we can work out what to do about that. The clearest idea I've had, and Tim, you'll know the origin of this, because I took one of Jim's quotes, which is my favorite Jim quote, which is, "In Gaia, we're just another species, neither the owners nor the stewards of the planet." He says, "Our future depends," he says, "much more upon a right relationship with Gaia than with the never-ending drama of human interest." And to me, those are the two worldviews. We have the right relationship with Gaia, which we're aiming for now, that through the stuff that Bruno Latour and Tim talked about in intellectual terms and scholarly terms. That's a right relationship with Gaia. But we are struggling with this never-ending drama.
Yeah, we are.
Politics, economics. I mean, that's just human interest. That's got nothing to do, in inverted commas, with Gaia. It's got everything to do with Gaia, but it's not informed by Gaia. Okay, so you've got these two worlds, and I labeled them with the acronyms. So I called the never-ending drama of human interest, that's Nadoe. That's your Nadoe worldview, and Iguajas is the in Gaia we're just another species. So I used those two terms for a long time. I've just dug out, Tim, 2004 at Dartington. And I did a closing speech, and you did a closing speech there, and realized I was using this Nadoe Iguaja stuff. I then discovered that Yuval Noah Harari, the most amazing historian, has got his own explanation of that. He's not a Gaia man at all, but he calls them real reality and fictional realities. And I just love the way he pinpointed that we're the only species that creates fictional realities, and that never-ending drama of human interest is purely about fictional realities we made up, and they're not to do with Gaia. So it is like, he's got a lovely TED talk, and at the end of it, Harari says, so you've got these real realities like mountains and lions and tigers, and then you've got these fictional realities like Google and nation states and the World Bank. He says, and the way these fictional realities have taken over, the very existence of lions and rivers and mountains now depends on decisions made by Google and the World Bank, which are purely figments of our imagination. And I use that as well, that dual reality thing, as a clear way of keeping these two worlds apart in my head, so that I can think clearly about, where do the fictional realities end and where does the Gaia reality begin? And from that perspective, I think it's really interesting, because as beings, as organisms, we are Gaia realities. That's what we are. We are permutations of wisdom. Okay, but we are lumbered every day of our lives. We're trying to cope with all these fictions. So actually, all we've got to do is change the stories, change the fictions. If you don't like the economic system, make up a new one. And that, to me, in my artistic mind, says it's as easy as that. But of course, to change an economic system, how do we do that? And somebody said about, I think it was Laura, how many people do you have to get on board? Well, I think if you tell most poor people and most disadvantaged people in the world that for example, what we'll do is we'll just recycle. Let's do recycling. Let's recycle the wealth. Let's recycle the wealth and give everybody enough to live off without having to work. But what you have to do is you have to be active in your community. What are you good at? I'm good at making music. Okay, you can be the musician in our community and you can help us all make music. Yeah. Okay, so that's the way I'm coming at the thing. And the Gaia Choir sings songs about that. So
I'm all for it, as you know, PT. I mean, yeah. I would. You're not alone. Well, none of us are alone. There's, for example, something called ecotippingpoints.org from 20 years ago, which catalogs 100 instances of these bottom-up movements of exactly what you and I have described. So this stuff bubbles up all the time. I think that point about this deeper point about learning is a good one as well, because we now trace the last common ancestor of all life and Gaia back to almost 4,300 million years ago. So very close to actually the origin of the Earth. It's just amazing now. And the whole story in science that we're still trying to get down is to understand you could call it the learning process by which Gaia got ever better at cycling those elements and stabilizing bits of the climate and flourishing. But I love I'm good with everything you said on ways of disentangling the elements and moving forward. But I guess what can I say, folks, apart from you have to engage with the world as it is, and that's your point, Pete, but that means if we're to get out of trouble, it has to mean engaging with the Nidoi, like them, dislike them or not. I suppose. So Ruben, you come in because we're going to run out of time. I've got to give my daughter some dinner.
Thanks. I'm just wondering about the political ramifications of this Gaia way of thinking. You mentioned a few already, but not sure if you could elaborate a tiny bit.
Yeah, maybe I should dig out and send round that paper that I flashed up with Bruno, because I think that's the longest exposition we have of what we're getting at. But we mean it in the broadest senses of the word, I think. And Latour himself wrote beautifully on this in his small books. One of them was called Down to Earth. And I think the last book with a co-author that he produced is also pertinent, although it's quite practical, and it's written, I've forgotten the name of it now, which is stupid, but it's written to the would-be sort of champions of a new green politics. Anyway, the fundamental points are, if you take this Gaia view to heart, if you see the world that way, then, and you recognize your dependence on other living things, then it would make some kind of sense to have their voices, if I can call them that, represented in your political consideration. So Latour was writing about that in the 90s as the Parliament of Things, and various people have taken that idea, artists and others, and run with it. And of course, I would say that the Rights of Nature movement and Stop Ecocide International are other ramifications of trying to readjust who and what has legal status to give a voice, if I can call it that, and a status to the elements of the glorious living, or whatever you want to call it, Gaia, that we depend upon. So that's one of the key ramifications. We are part and parcel of a very democratic entity, as Lovelock put it. The practicalities of that are obviously interesting, and we're gonna again have to experiment and see practically how we can take that stuff on board. But that's just enough. Let's let Barbara come in before we run out of time. But that's one of the fundamental parts. There's quite a few more, but if you find extending the domain of freedom in, or if I can find it and put it in the chat, that's there's a few more in there. Okay.
Thanks, Emil.
Thank you, Tim. That was amazing. I'd like to go back to the social tipping points.
Yeah.
I wonder, has there been or there is any good mapping of social agents or these new narratives that we are talking about? So we can see what's actually happening on the planetary scale. Where are these narrative that Peter was talking about? And so we intentionally, I would say, facilitate or contribute to this narrative because they get pushed down by the mainstream media.
Exactly. I love that, because I had basically the same thought you have, which is how can we find out about this stuff and how can we connect this stuff together? So my idea, and it's only an idea, is you want to have like a wiki space of where everybody who's engaged in these activities and narratives actually shares and records the learning by doing of what they're doing. And that can work. Wikipedia works, right? People come in, we host a Wikimedian in residence who edits the pages and continually makes it better. But we need some kind of information, knowledge, learning, sharing thing, in my view. I mentioned that ecotippingpoints.org website because that predates all of that, that captures still at least 100 different stories of great bottom-up initiatives, feedback loop maps, little 5-10 minute videos about some of them telling stories. We just, like you, I think we need to put a little bit of wrapping around this, but we just need to support you. It's basically supporting the heterarchy. You can't do collective learning and towards Gaia unless you're sharing. You've got an effective way of sharing who's doing what and the learning that's going on. So that's my idea for everybody. I'm not very good at fundraising anyway, and it's not, I prefer, so we're going to need a few other people who believe in that idea, and we're going to need a bit of collective effort probably to make something, to start something. But in the spirit of Wikipedia, you can, once you've got the architecture there and you get people on board, it'll grow by itself, right? That would be, in my view, that would be cool to have, and it'll be a counter space to the things you hinted at, the kind of rather dull Nadoe of the mainstream media. And there'll be plenty of us will get on there and I think and pour in content. That's my gut instinct anyway.
Great, thanks.
Thanks, Barbara. And so I think that was our last question for the evening. And so with this, yes, and Amy just said Whole Earth Wiki. I think,
or Gaia Wiki or
Gaia
Gwiki or something like that. I don't know. Peter's better than I am at cool names, but Gwiki I quite like already. Or Gaia Wiki.
We have our homework. We'll be sent forth into the world to carry this out now. So you've given us some good homework, Tim.
Cool.
But thank you really on behalf of all of us. Thank you for giving this talk this evening, and also thank you for helping us to really bring this series full circle. which started in the beginning of 2023, February 2023 with Bruno. And now it's nice that we are full circle closing with you. And so thank you so much. And of course, it's just the beginning of a conversation. So in some sense, we'd love to continue this conversation, in the next months and years, perhaps. And so maybe we'll be finding some creative ways to do that outside of this particular series. But we will certainly call upon the collective intelligence of the community to do so. So thank you so much, Tim, once again.
Thanks for having me. Thanks.
I think I have a couple of announcements for those who are still with us in December. Our next talk for the Emily Friends community will be by Merrick McGann. He'll be offering a talk called Messy Entanglements and Ethical Orientations of Enacted Bodies. So working very much from within the enactive tradition, which is dear to us at Mind and Life Europe. That's on the 5th of December. And then we have a community contemplative practice session open to everyone. Our last one of the year, if you'd like to join, on December 17th. That's Tuesday at the same time, 6 p.m. So once again, thanks to all for joining us, and thanks especially to those who've been following the series from day one. And be well, take care, everyone, and have a nice evening or rest of your day.